Chapter 11. Sex and Zina. Sex sells, the same way drugs sell. Why is the music and movie industry so sex-obsessed? We are told that it is because sex sells, i.e. the masses want sex. They want to see that and consume that. So these industries are simply meeting an already existing demand. In reality, these industries are creating the demand. They are forcing shamelessness down people's throats until they create a dependency. It works the same way with the proliferation of drugs. No one naturally wants to inhale smoke. No one wakes up wanting to inject deadly chemicals into the veins. No one naturally desires to drink the rancid, rotten fermentation of putrid fruits and vegetables. These are all artificial desires that these industries spend billions of dollars a year implanting into people's hearts by way of advertising and other forms of cultural engineering, until people think that these desires are naturally arising and therefore must be pursued and fulfilled. This is why Western morality is so naturalistic. According to it, the most moral thing is to act in accordance with natural human rights and natural human interests. This is what the liberal human rights regime is predicated on. But no one cares to ask, well, how natural are these rights and interests? And even if they are natural, who decided we are morally required to act in line with whatever is natural? The sexual misery of the Western world. After Woodstock came campus surveys on sexual assault. After bra burning came date rape. The sexual revolution of the 1960s aroused enthusiasm at first, but passions have since waned. Those movements have come to look imperfect, even ugly. For one thing, they have failed to touch meaning, purpose, or fulfillment, especially the fulfillment relating to sex. Revolution doesn't mean progress. The recent finding that 1 in 4 Western women in college are victims of sexual assault by Western men ominously mirrors the fact that 1 in 4 Western women will be victims of domestic violence at some point in their lives. These grim stats have led people in the West to realize that one of the great miseries plaguing much of the so-called Western world and the liberal secular world more generally is its sick relationship with women and girls. If they are not being paraded around in sleazy beauty contests at the tender age of 5, or being berated by sex-positive feminists for not embracing their inner sex goddess. At a minimum, Western females can look forward to a life of chronic clinical depression and loneliness, if not outright domestic abuse and sexual violence. To address the latter, both Western universities and workplaces alike have taken to producing extensive guides of good conduct for college boys and male employees due to their preternatural propensity to date rape and sexually harass their female counterparts. The commodity of sex. Sex is a complex commodity, commercialized in places like New York, London, Paris, or Amsterdam. By way of liberalism's hypersexualized culture, the voyeuristic pressures of social media, and the pornographic images of women or their body parts in the advertising-saturated West. These together create a potent environment of overexposure and desensitization, where people, like drug addicts, looking for a stronger high, must increasingly resort to more extreme sexual acts and fetishes in order to generate the same arousal. Not surprisingly, this escalation has led to an epidemic of perversion and sexual abnormalities ranging from zoo to pedophilia, each deviance with its own group and its own social movement, and dedicated social justice warriors advocating for acceptance and celebration. Today, sex is a great paradox in many countries of the Western world. One acts as though it's all that exists, and yet it means absolutely nothing. Overindulged in a Tinder-induced stupor of casual copulation, it weighs on the mind by its very vacuousness. Although Western females are regularly accosted by the unsolicited genitalia of sexting grade school football players as well as respected congressmen, they are encouraged to bear their own assets on Instagram and Snapchat in a social media stream of simultaneously narcissistic and desperate cries for validation. The war on women. Women are a recurrent theme in daily discourse because the stakes they personify for myths of Western superiority, progress, and exclusivism are great. In some countries, they are allowed access to the public sphere only if they renounce their wombs. To be satisfied with women living as mothers and mere homemakers would be to uncover the paradox that feminists and progressives desperately need to deny. Maybe Western women can't have it all. Mothers are seen as a source of destabilization. Extended maternity leaves triggered profit loss, some say, and are respected only when defined by a corporate relationship as a senior VP of X or up-and-coming manager of Y. These contradictions create unbearable tensions. Womanhood has no outlet, no outcome. Starting a family is no longer a means for support, love, and fulfillment, but a burden to be put off for as long as possible. The sexual and psychological misery that results can descend into absurdity and hysteria. Here too, one hopes to experience familial love, but the mechanisms for that love, marriage, child-rearing, familial stability are prevented. Half of all the children born in the West are born to single mothers, which is disturbing given the fact that there is a direct, undeniable correlation between single-family homes and crime rates. Though this might partially explain why some Western countries have the highest rates of homicide and violent crime in the world. And for the few Westerners that are married, the specter of infidelity looms large, as even adultery has been commercialized, where cheating websites like Ashley Madison cater to tens of millions of registered users. In some Western lands, the war on women has the air of a theatrical farce. Western women spend over $20 billion annually on cosmetics and perfumes and another $12 billion on cosmetic surgery, while only $22 billion is needed for feed, clothe, and provide basic health care for the entire world's poor. All this expenditure to abide by artificial standards of fashion and beauty dictated by the corporate conglomerates profiting from the Western women's need to be sexy. Of course, that very need only arises due to women being deliberately socialized to obsess over every detail of their bodies, such that millions of females, some as young as 11 years old, suffer from eating disorders and other forms of body dysmorphic maladies. Unfortunately for these Western women, who are literally starving themselves for attention, Western men in the thick of their own crisis of masculinity doesn't seem to be interested, as they've been thoroughly desensitized by endless amounts of internet porn. And when the ADHD adult gentlemen are not masturbating, they're too busy playing video games and killing themselves. Tragically, suicide is the single biggest cause of death in men aged 20 to 49 in some Western countries. Fantasy or reality? One result is that people fantasize about the trappings of another world, either the world peddled by popular culture and Disney films about romance and monogamous love between soulmates, happily ever after, or the sexually promiscuous, at times violent world of hookups, no consequence, no commitment sex, more at home on the set of a pornographic film than in the realm of reality. It's a choice perfectly illustrated by the offerings of the Western media. Miley Cyrus and other former Musketeers gone bad are all the rage on television, as is the sexualization of young girls and tweens, pushed to empower themselves and own their sexuality by dressing and acting like porn stars, peddling the promise of their unattainable bodies and impossible sex well before puberty. Clothing is also given to extremes. Western women naively believe their wardrobes to be a function of free and independent choice, yet despite that belief, they all dress more or less identically. Sex therapists are legion in the Western world, and their advice, no matter how contradictory or ludicrous, is voraciously consumed. These self-anointed gurus have a de facto monopoly on talk about the body, sex, and love. With the internet, daytime TV, and gossip magazines galore, some of their tips have taken monstrous forms, devolving into a kind of porno psychology. A simple perusal of the women's magazine covers at the typical Western grocery store, quote, "Help your lover shop for an escort," end quote, and more. Sex is everywhere, especially in schools. Orgasms are required as soon as puberty is within reach and a warm body is available. To be a virgin past an arbitrary age is to be an outcast. These pressures, combined with a barrage of sexualized images and content in media and environment, make for a dangerous mix. Incidences of prepubescent elementary school boys gang raping their female classmates are a growing phenomena in many Western cities. But young girls don't just have their male classmates to worry about. Violent sex offenders, in the West at least the ones who are caught and convicted, serve shockingly short prison sentences before being considered rehabilitated and led back into society. In some parts of the West, offenders who commit sex crimes against children on average serve less time in prison than offenders who commit the same crimes against adults. And it is not only about degenerates molesting children. Producers, distributors, and consumers of child pornography and child sex slavery include famous filmmakers, celebrated sandwich spokesmen, and billionaire hedge fund bankers. Even prominent Harvard Law School professors like Alan Dershowitz are committing acts of pedophilia and sex trafficking on the weekends, allegedly. Apparently, the lure of innocent, virginal children is too much for the West's rich and famous. These otherworldly delights are the unspoken rewards for those who do well in the lands of sexual misery. Dreaming about such prospects, pedophilic business moguls surrender to a terrifying surrealistic logic. The path to orgasm is through predatory domination, not love. The West has long found comfort in exoticism, which exonerates differences. Satellite TV and the World Wide Web has a way of normalizing cultural variations and of excusing any abuses. Beyonce, Playboy, and twerking exempted some Easterners from considering the plight of Western women. Other than India and Zimbabwe, the rest of the top 10 countries with the highest incidence of rape in the world are Western. Despite all this soul-rending misery, Western imperialists have taken it upon themselves to export their unique brand of sexual liberation to the rest of the world, saving and rescuing women in developing nations by way of military occupation and an unending stream of NGOs ready to civilize societies who know nothing of the superior sexual values of the morally superior West. What long seemed like the foreign spectacles of faraway places now feels like a clash of cultures playing out around the globe. Differences once diffused by distance and a sense of isolation have become an imminent threat. People around the globe, i.e. the long-time subjects of Western imperialistic pillaging and rape, are discovering with anxiety and fear that sex in the Western world is sick, and that its venereal disease has long infected the rest of the world. There's only one kind of safe sex. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not, or if you believe in God or not. There is no such thing as safe sex if you are not married. If there is no paper involved between you and whoever you are sleeping with, you are at the mercy of that person, and there is very little anyone can do to help you if something happens, be it accidental, deliberate, or malicious. This is a matter of life and death, in the most literal sense, whether you are talking about the potential to create life, i.e. a human being, or the contraction of life-threatening diseases, or any other kind of possible emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, or all of the above. This used to be common knowledge. This used to be common sense. But now just pointing this out means you're a religious fundamentalist who has turned off his brain and doesn't understand human rights and the value of sexual autonomy and blah blah blah. How blind can you be? Is this really so hard for people to understand? As Muslims, yes, we abide by Islamic law when it comes to premarital abstinence and marriage, etc. First and foremost because we hear and obey our Creator. No doubt about it. But when we recognize the clear benefit and wisdom in His commands and make note of that in our crazy topsy-turvy world, does that mean we are rationalists trying to receive Mu'tazili philosophy, etc.? You don't have to be a hardcore theological rationalist to point out the stupidity at play here. Premarital sex is not a victimless crime. People sometimes jokingly ask, why is it that driving requires a license, but you can have children without a license or any kind of certification? It's often a light-hearted remark, but when you think about it, it's a legitimate question. If driving or teaching at a school, practicing medicine or law, or even being a plumber requires certification, then what about something that is far more sensitive, far more significant, like having children and raising them? After all, children are our future, and the state of our society as a whole depends on how children are brought up. Their morals, their sense of responsibility, their character, and so on. It's no secret that children who grow up without proper parental influence are far more likely to become involved in drugs and crime, to face unemployment, to fail becoming productive members of society and upright human beings. This, then, has a toll on all of us, on all members of society. Given these high stakes, one has to wonder how any civilized nation could allow its people to have children without having some kind of regulations to ensure that all children have competent parents. Isn't it a child's right to have a stable household and parents who are capable of properly raising him? Isn't it our right as members of society to make sure incompetent, irresponsible people in our midst aren't having children that they will neglect, children who will be more likely to become burdens on society? Islam, of course, does require just such a license, a nikah. Properly done according to prophetic guidance, a nikah ensures that a couple is in the best position to raise a family, with the full support of the extended family and the community at large. Yet, Islamic sexual ethics have been the target of unrelenting criticism from modernists and liberals for decades, who argue that Islamic law stifles the sexual freedom and autonomy of individuals by prohibiting premarital sex. To the contrary, this prohibition protects people's freedom and autonomy because it effectively curbs the amount of children being born to single mothers and couples who are not in a position to take adequate care for them. This in turn benefits the interests of children and hence the interest of society at large. So even if one is not religious per se, the rational merits of prohibiting premarital sex are more than clear, and all the sociological evidence supports this. Put differently, premarital sex is not a victimless crime as some believe. Side note, the inevitable remark to this point is, what about conception? The inevitable remark to this point is, what about contraception? If impregnation is impossible, then where is the victim? Two easy replies. First, on analogy with other kinds of certifications and licenses, airplanes have had autopilot for decades. That doesn't mean pilots don't need to be certified before flying commercial jets. Second, if the existence of contraception coupled with widespread sex education were enough to prevent unwanted pregnancies, why has single motherhood continued to rise decade after decade for the past 50 years, such that today, nearly half of all children are in single-parent homes? All the statistics prove, indubitably, that these children are worse off than children who grow up with their fathers in their lives. It is a major crime that most modern nations have allowed to run rampant. This in turn affects the crime rate. It affects the percentage of the population that requires government assistance through welfare, unemployment benefits, etc. In effect, it makes people far more dependent on the state, thus increasing state power exponentially. It is no wonder that modern nation states have shown no interest in upholding sexual ethics that human societies of all religions have depended on for thousands of years. In sum, we can make an unimpeachable case for why Islamic sexual ethics are rationally and ethically superior to the secular liberal alternative. So, if a religious argument against things like dating, hooking up, etc. is not convincing, then the rationalistic argument should suffice to make the moral case. At the very least, even if someone does not ultimately agree with this reasoning, he can admit that it is reasonable, and that is enough to characterize Islam's sexual ethics concerning zina as rational and not simply prudish, close-minded, backwards, cruel, and all the other cheap adjectives used to denigrate Islamic law. Sex is taboo in Islam. Does the fact that Muslims don't openly and explicitly talk about sex mean that sex is taboo in Islam? Does the fact that Muslims don't have the same approach to sex education and sexual expression as modern sex-positive feminists and psychologists mean that Muslims have an unhealthy attitude towards sex? It is amusing how anything that does not fit in the mold that the modern gurus of sexuality have defined for themselves is characterized as unhealthy. Well, Muslims think there is plenty that is unhealthy, backwards, and destructive with the state of sexuality in modern society, so you'll have to excuse us if we're not overly eager to get pointers from you on the subject. The purpose of sex education. Kids are getting sex education in school at younger and younger ages. When I was in grade school, sex ed wasn't taught until the 10th grade. Now, middle schools and sometimes elementary schools have these programs. What is the impact of this on a child's psyche and development, and what will be the impact collectively for society? My dad was telling me that in the past, in Muslim cultures, parents didn't talk to their kids about this until puberty, and even then, they would not be explicit about it because they understood the power of human curiosity. If you talk to a child about this, they will be that much more likely to be curious about it. They would want to investigate further and try it, and that's not a positive result, no matter what modern psychologists tell us about being sex positive, etc. The content of the material being taught is also changing apparently. They are teaching elementary school children about sexual fluidity, sex orientation, and that you have the option of selecting your gender identity, and whether you like boys or girls or both, or neither, or beyond. You don't have to be a fortune teller to guess what kind of impact this will have on our children and hence our future. But you have to really be amazed by the liberal philosophy underlying all this, namely, why shouldn't small children learn about sex? Sex is just a healthy, natural part of life, right? There is no shame in learning about what the human body can do. Besides, what possible reason is there to not teach kids this stuff? They probably know about it anyway from TV, etc. Consider the parallels this has to the satanic discourse, when Iblis deceived Adam and Hawa to approach the tree and their shame became apparent to them. In the same vein, from the satanic perspective, there's nothing better than children knowing about sex as soon as they can talk and understand language. And of course, this would be portrayed as positive, progressive, and healthy. The reality is, sex by default is something shameful in itself, and it is only transformed to something very positive, beneficial, healthy, and elevated when it is in accord with Allah's commands. So much so that Allah rewards having sex when it is done in this lawful way. But this is not the perspective and logic our children are being taught. So it is no surprise that they increasingly see traditional religion as out of touch and irrelevant. If you learn in school that there is nothing more healthy than sex by default, then only something impractical, evil even, would hinder that in any way. Child marriage in Bangladesh. Comparing child marriage in countries like Bangladesh to marriage in the US or Western Europe, where the average age of marriage is in the late 20s and early 30s, is comparing apples and oranges. Western media is at pains to portray 14, 15, and 16-year-olds in Muslim countries as innocent little children forced into an institution against their will. The pertinent comparison to make is with Western 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who, due to circumstance, are sexualized by peer pressure and the influence of pop culture, fashion, sex education, and so on. Look at the pressure sexting culture puts on children and how the cell phone technology have dramatically changed youth sexuality in the West. It is now very common for 12 and 13-year-olds to be sexually active, and it is not seen as a problem in the West. Rather than teach abstinence, educators have decided that elementary and middle school children need to learn about safe sex. There's nothing objectionable for two teens under 18 to have sex, with protection, to pass around naked pictures of themselves through Snapchat as long as it's only other teens seeing the pictures, etc. In fact, it's healthy, empowering, and all but encouraged by parents, schools, and society at large. But if a 15-year-old gets married in Bangladesh, that is heartbreaking, infuriating violation of a girl's dignity. So the problem can't be that teen brides are sexualized. If the problem is that getting married at a young age hinders a teen's education, that is also something that can be said about sexually active teens here in the West. How much time, mental energy, and resources are spent by our children participating in all these cultural practices revolving around dating, hooking up, sexting, prom, and on and on. Again, no one thinks of any of that in terms of opportunity cost vis-a-vis education. Finally, if the problem is about coercion and consent, then these teen brides really don't want to get married. I would simply argue that coercion is a context-dependent concept. I'm sure that nowadays there are many brides in countries like Bangladesh that truly do feel miserable and coerced to have to get married at 15. But these feelings do not arise in a vacuum. They arise in the context of a society that has, through the influence of satellite TV and internet, adopted Western cultural norms. Norms that portray their being a teenager as a time for casual dating, boyfriend-girlfriend relations, and so on. If you grow up thinking that that is what it means to be normal, free, and liberated, then of course you will have to be coerced to follow a path that diverges from that model. But if the context is absent, what is inherently wrong with getting married young? What exactly is it that makes contemporary Western norms superior? Ironically, it is precisely that context of casual sex being imported from Western sources that is scaring traditional families into wanting their children, and especially their daughters, married at a young age, whereas before, there may have been more of an allowance for education. Point being, this is a complex issue, but Western media prefers to push a highly ethnocentric, simplistic narrative punctuated with manipulative pictures of sad brides. Usually the media reporting does not include actual quotes from the bride themselves. Everything we get is filtered through the perspective and ideological bias of the Western reporter. Also, to be perfectly clear, I am not defending all the cultural practices surrounding marriage in Bangladesh or wherever else. My point is to highlight some of the double standards and unfair caricaturing Western media engages in their portrayal of cultures they believe to be inferior. Ikhtilat. It is very sad to see Muslims, including supposedly knowledgeable Muslims, whine and pout about the very basic Islamic principle, which is avoidance of ikhtilat, blameworthy gender mixing. Gender mixing leads to flirting. Flirting leads to touching. Touching leads to zina. Zina leads to the destruction of marriage. The destruction of marriage leads to the downfall of family. The downfall of family leads to the end of humanity. Keep the partitions up. Is this exaggeration? Not at all. Anyone who has eyes, has knowledge, and is honest knows that blameworthy gender mixing not only leads to all this, it can also lead to much worse, the fire. I expect the usual liberal feminist reaction to such issues, but liberal feminists in sheikhs' clothing also chime in with pro-ikhtilat attitudes and truly asinine statements that do nothing but show the pettiness and ignorance of the people making them. If you disagree with my characterization of the consequences of ikhtilat, please answer these questions. Does blameworthy gender mixing, as is common in today's society with Muslims and non-Muslims in social settings involving casual friendly interactions, involve plenty of flirting, not to mention other problems like sexual harassment, unwanted attention, etc.? Does this interaction in many cases lead to things that are clearly haram? For example, gazing at non-mahrams, touching them, smelling them, etc.? Does the prevalence of zina in society obstruct marriage as well as destroy marriages and lead to all kinds of societal harms, with over 50% of children born in the West born into single-mother households, where children born into single-mother households are significantly more likely to get into crime, drugs, drop out of school, be unemployed, fall into depression, etc., etc.? Is the state of marriage in today's society anything but complete chaos, where over 50% end up in divorce and around 25% of married men admit to cheating and 50% of women admit to it, where adultery sites like Ashley Madison have millions of registered users, etc., etc.? It is difficult to understand how a Muslim can know about all these things and not be alarmed. It is difficult to understand how a Muslim can know that one of the signs of the last day is the increase of zina, and even zina is being committed in the street, and not be alarmed by everything around us. What do you think is the prime contributor of such state at the end of times? If you don't think it is ikhtilat, please enlighten us with your own explanation. And say if the Muslim just needs to have taqwa argument. It is surprising to see this new modernist line being used to dissolve some of the clear boundaries set by the Sharia and agreed upon by all scholars. It doesn't matter how much taqwa you have. If you are a man or a woman, being alone with the opposite sex is prohibited, whereas what constitutes khalwa in itself has further details. Casually hanging out with the opposite sex just for the purpose of socializing, having fun, joking around is prohibited. Yes, again, there are many details and many situations that fall into a grey area, but let's not pretend like Islamic law is okay with the kind of free-for-all that characterizes Western liberal cultural standards. As for partitions in the masjid, that requires lengthy elaboration as well, but I find it shocking how inconsistent the people opining on this are in arguing that partitions are illegitimate. They know, of course, that they cannot argue that partitions are haram or blameworthy innovation. So they avoid that by making simplistic statements about the Prophet's mosque not having partitions between the men and women's prayer area. They conveniently don't comment, however, on all of the hadith that describe how the Sahabiyah were dressed, what times of day they attended the masjid, how they were positioned in the masjid, in what conditions they were prohibited by the Prophet ﷺ from going to the masjid, etc., etc. The prohibition of ikhtilat is not something Muslims should be ashamed of. Not only is the lack of ikhtilat required by piety and God consciousness, it is the mark of high civilization, culture, and class that unmarried men and women do not freely mix, flirt, and roll around with each other like animals. This is the Islamic ethos which has been practiced for centuries throughout the Muslim world. Muslims today who are embarrassed about this and hide it behind cherry-picked narrations to justify a liberalized view should just stop embarrassing themselves. P.S. Imam Ghazali rahimahullah wrote the following, quote, "If the first inward thought is not warded off, it will generate a desire. Then the desire will generate a wish, and the wish will generate an intention, and the intention will generate the action, and the action will result in ruin and divine wrath. So evil must be cut off at its root, which is when it is simply a thought that crosses the mind, from which all the other things follow on." End quote. Wow, is Imam Ghazali an extremist? He thinks that a spontaneous thought in the inner depths of one's heart can lead to existential ruin and divine wrath? Talk about a slippery slope. How much more slippery is it when the first step is not a secret thought, but actual physical activity and mixing? Sadaqallahul Azim.